So there was no way I could follow the intro that ACG gave for us this morning. So I just want to start by saying thanks for joining me this morning. My name is Brad Davis. I'm a commissioning engineer with AECOM. You may have heard of us, a very large company. We're involved in pretty much every part of the design and construction industry that you could possibly think of. We have offices and projects worldwide. I work in our commissioning group, obviously. We have a pretty multi-discipline group at AECOM, so I get to work with other mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, fire protection engineers, architects, TAP professionals, and then I have access to subject matter experts in almost any field you could possibly imagine. So I stick mostly with HVAC and controls commissioning. I'm pretty much full-time working on commissioning projects, so very much hands-on with a lot of projects. And what I kind of learn is when we get a project, especially if it's something big and fun, big and exciting, say conference center like we're in now, maybe the airport like we came through to get here, or a school or something like that. We get these big projects with all these systems, we immediately gravitate right towards the big, fun, exciting systems. So you get an airport or something, you're diving into the chiller systems, you're looking at the boiler systems. You may have handfuls and handfuls and handfuls of air handlers, outside air units, and all that fun stuff. We don't really give much thought to the smaller systems, or especially the unfamiliar systems. So when we have these big projects, say the conference center here, or an airport, or a school, at some point we're going to run into the kitchen systems. So I don't know about you, but I've had these big projects that go fairly smoothly. We kind of know what to expect when we're messing with our chill water system, our boiler system. We kind of know what is going to happen there. Then we get down into the kitchen ventilation systems and we just hit a brick wall. We have ongoing issues, integration issues, we have things that hold up our project, and it's just a struggle sometimes. So the goal for today is to dive into what we're going to see in our food service areas a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the special requirements that we're going to see in these areas. We'll talk about some of the challenges we might run into. And then finally, we're going to talk about what we can do as commissioning providers to help overcome some of these challenges, or to minimize the impacts of the issues that we run into when we're trying to test and turn over these projects. So imagine most everyone here is commissioning providers, correct? Yeah, over half the room here. So hopefully we can help on our next project, make it a little smoother integration and turnover process when we're dealing with these kitchen ventilation systems. So a few housekeeping things. You're going to see these for the rest of the week. You can get your credit, sign in on your app, don't steal, course description, learning objectives. This is all stuff you can get your hands on later on if you missed something today. So let's dive straight in to what we're going to talk about today, how we're going to go through today's presentation. So quick overview. First, we're going to talk about the different elements you're going to see in your kitchen spaces. If you haven't commissioned one, or you didn't have a job in food service when you were in high school or college, you might not know exactly what you're going to see there and what you're going to expect. And we'll talk about some of the special requirements that these spaces have. You can probably guess a few of them right off the top of your head, but we'll talk about those just a little bit. We'll go into some common approaches of how we're going to meet all these requirements. And then we'll talk about challenges you're likely to run into. And then finally, what can we do as commissioning providers to help overcome these challenges and minimize impacts later in the project. So as promised, let's dive into what you might see in your typical food service space. So this here is a snapshot from a school I did not too long ago, the layout of the kitchen area, just so we can kind of get an idea of what we're going to see here. So obvious, first thing, dead center, of the photo right there is your food prep area. This is where all the preparations and cooking and plating or whatever you might be doing is going to take place. We have our obvious requirements right here of ventilation. If you're cooking, you're going to need some sort of hood or something above you. So that's the obvious one. Some of the other things that you might run into, you're going to have cold storage, you're going to have coolers, you're going to have freezers. Just keep in mind that it's not just your cooking area, you're going to have that refrigeration aspect of it as well. Another thing you don't really think about is you're going to have locker room spaces. The workers come in, need to drop their stuff, put on their uniforms or whatever it may be. So you're going to have locker rooms. We've probably worked on locker rooms before. You have a little bit different requirements in your locker rooms than you're going to have in, say, a classroom or a dining room. You also are going to have a restroom in there, most likely. So that has its own requirements. Janitor closet, where you have your chemicals and mop sink. So we have to kind of keep in mind that that space might have a little bit different requirements. You're going to have an office. So most of these areas have some sort of manager or managerial staff. They need a place to work. We all want our offices to be comfortable, just like these folks do. So you might see a little bit different requirements in that area. Storage. We're going to have pots, pans, food, all that type stuff. So you may have multiple storages, and these storage areas might have different requirements depending on what's being stored in there. You may have a dish room. You can imagine there's a lot of hot water, a lot of steam that you're going to have to deal with in there. So again, maybe different requirements. And finally, your dining areas. Obviously, you want the conditions in your dining room to be a little bit more favorable than you might have when you're standing over the grill in the kitchen. So different elements of the kitchen area that you might not think about if you've never walked through and paid attention. So we'll dig into some of the big requirements we're going to see. So this one is fairly obvious, ventilation. So in our kitchens, we're going to have ovens, grills, steamers, dishwashers, all different type of equipment. These are going to put off heat, smoke, fumes, odors, moisture. We've got to get that out. So that's fairly simple. You're going to have a kitchen hood. You're going to have special exhaust fans to go along with that. That can deal with the heat and the moisture and the grease. And then special ductwork so that we're not burning our buildings down with these systems here. So this photo here is the hood system being installed in that school I showed you in the last slide. So you could see the hood's in place and they're starting to run the ductwork down to it. Next big item is pressure control. So this is going to end up causing issues for us later if we're not very, very careful. So we just talked about ventilation. We have a lot of air being pulled out of this space to capture that heat, that smoke, those odors, the fumes, the moisture that's coming along with all of the activities that are being done in these spaces. When you pull all that air out, you've got to bring some air in to balance it out so you're not sucking doors shut and letting fumes go where they're not supposed to. So you're going to be bringing in a lot of outside air. As you can imagine, your balancing becomes very important. Your airflows become very important, and controlling pressures between different spaces becomes very important when you have this level of air moving out and makeup air being brought in. So we're going to talk about pressure being challenges later on, and that's going to be something that we're always going to have to keep in mind. So it sounds simple, but it's not always done correctly. We've actually had clients at the beginning of projects come to us and specifically call out food odors being an issue with their previous projects. So don't take it for granted, because your owners, if their occupants are in here listening to me and we smell lunch being cooked, they're not going to be very happy about that. So keep in mind. So it's not just something that we're talking about as engineers. The owners actually care about this stuff as well. So this brings into account different things, your tab, your airflows, different pressures. There's also could be envelope factors that you need to think about, how tight you're building. we have a real leaky building? Do we have a pretty solid building? Do we have doors, windows that may be opened or closed? So there's different things to take into account when you're thinking about pressure in these areas. Finally, here's the big one. We run into this pretty much every project we're on these days: energy savings. So the ventilation systems are our big energy users from the building side when we're talking about food service spaces, as you can imagine. So what we want to do here, the main way of saving energy with these building systems in the kitchen is what we call demand control kitchen ventilation. Essentially what you're doing is you want to vary the ventilation you're providing to these spaces based on the cooking load that's going on now. So you don't want your fan on your hood system and your makeup air running full speed all the time, because that's just going to burn energy. So we need to vary this. How are we going to do this? So this is kind of the unknown that we have a hard time finding out when we're commission providers on these projects. It's not something that the manufacturers talk about a lot, is how we're going to do that. What are kind of our sequences and sensors and control strategies to control the demand-controlled ventilation and to save us energy? So we're going to take a couple of minutes here while we're talking about energy savings to run through a few of the control strategies you'll see being used for the demand-controlled systems to try to back down that fan speed. So the first one you're going to see most common, and it's probably one of the simplest ones, is using temperature sensors to control the speed of the exhaust fan. So this can be done several different ways. You might put a temperature sensor in the hood. You might put multiple. You may have them in the ducts. This photo here is a temperature sensor in a duct coming off of a kitchen hood. You may use multiple. You may use it in conjunction with a wall sensor to control to a differential. You may just have hood sensors that have different set points. When temperature gets to this, run the fan speed here. When your temperature gets to this, run the fan speed here. So temperature control is what we're going to run into most of the time. Along with that, we have a couple other control strategies we might use. So optical sensors is something you might see. This just takes two sensors, points them at each other in the hood, and that can sense smoke or steam coming between those two sensors, and that can react the fan almost instantly when it sees that to a set point. Then you might fine-tune that with temperature control. So the good thing about using these optical sensors is they're going to be a little bit quicker to react than the temperature sensors. And another way of doing it is using infrared or thermal imaging sensors. So these would be up in your hood looking down on your cooking surfaces. So might be something where you go up and turn on a grill, that surface gets hot. The infrared sensor senses that there's heat below it, ramps that fan up to a preset speed, and then after a time delay, you might control based on your temperature now. The thermal imaging is basically the high-tech version of that infrared sensor, and this is pretty cool, at least I think so. You're looking down from your hood at all of your cooking equipment, and it gets a heat signature of the entire area under that hood. What you can do with this is, say you have a steamer, a fryer, and a grill underneath one hood. You turn that fryer on in the morning, start heating up the oil. That thermal imaging sensor can pick up the signature of heat just from that one piece of equipment. It knows what it is because it's programmed into the system, and it can provide ventilation based on that equipment that it senses that's operating. So you might see multiple of these working together, maybe even all three. So the last two, they react a little bit quicker, so that's why you might want to see these in your system so you can capture the initial odors or fumes or whatever it may be, and then maybe fine-tune that with your temperature sensors. So that's how we're typically going to see this demand-controlled kitchen ventilation system know how to back down our ventilation to match the cooking speed. There's other ways you might see this done. you could have your equipment tied directly to the hood system processor. So maybe you have a current sensor on an oven, turn the oven on, pick up that current sensor, sends that information to the hood systems to react to, or maybe it's direct communication between, say, an oven and the processor. So turn the oven on in the morning, it sends that information directly over to the system. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, quick question. Do you ever get any pushback from the fire inspector regarding these extra systems that ramp down and ramp up fan speeds?
So I'm not real heavy on the fire protection side, but if you want to get with me after, I can reach out to our experts on that, and we can kind of get you some more information if you'd like. So my information to contact me will be on the last slide. So one other way we may do it is we may see a schedule. So if you have a very strict schedule that you're going to be using in the kitchen area, maybe the ventilation system's set up to run purely based on the schedule or in conjunction with something. Yes.
Does the kitchen exhaust fans provided by, are they provided by the supplier, and then you have a control system that controls the other incoming air?
We're going to get to that in just a second. So, a few more things on energy savings. So by backing down that kitchen exhaust fan, obviously we're going to save energy anytime that fan's not running at 100%. We're going to get energy savings a few other ways. We talked about makeup air coming in to make up for some of the air that's being exhausted. That too is normally driven by a fan, so you save power on fans twice because that one's also going to slow down proportionately. A lot of times our makeup air is conditioned, maybe heated, maybe cooled, dehumidified, whatever it may be. So less volume of makeup air. You have less capacity demands to heat, cool, dehumidify that air. You save you energy again there. And some of these systems get even more fancy. If you have multiple hood systems, the demand control system can damper down hoods that aren't being used at the moment, so you're not ramping your fan unnecessarily. So they can get pretty complex and do a pretty good job saving our energy here. Other benefits that your owner's gonna always be happy about, that's not necessarily energy, is you're running these systems a little bit slower. You're running the heating and cooling systems a little bit below their peak capacity. They're gonna need less maintenance and they might last longer. So just a few other benefits that your owners are gonna like about having this. And finally, how much energy we're gonna be able to save? Compared to running these things full speed all the time, you could look at 30, 40% or way, way higher depending on different factors that play into it. So first off, the size of the system is pretty obvious. If you have a massive system you can turn down versus a small system, you have different savings capabilities there. The climate you're in, so if you're cooling makeup air every single day of the year versus being able to use economizer air for your makeup air, that's gonna make a little bit of difference on how much you can save here. And finally, the cooking volume. If you're working in a factory style place where you're full speed from morning to night, it's gonna not offer you as much savings as if the cooking load might peak at lunchtime and then they close up shop. So say like your school where they provide lunch and then clean up and go home. So energy savings, always a big topic, more and more these days. So this is how we're gonna do it. Most of the time in the kitchen is by using that demand control kitchen ventilation system. So today's presentation is going to focus on HVAC, but I wanted to mention a few other systems. These may be thrown into your commissioning scope. So we've always been told don't throw water on a grease fire. We're not going to have a wet pipe system over our fryers in the kitchen. So we'll have specialty fire suppression systems, and these are going to run into some of the same issues we'll talk about later on with integration. You might have issues integrating with the fire alarm control panel or getting these things to kind of communicate with everything that they need to communicate with, just like we'll see later on with some of these specialty ventilation systems. You may be asked to commission the kitchen equipment or the dishwashers. So we have a mixer here. How are you going to commission a mixer or a dishwasher? So we'll talk about some ways to commission systems that we might not 100% understand, and these will be things that you'll have to deal with case-by-case basis if the owner puts this in your scope. Refrigeration systems, we already talked about those. You could see that in your commissioning scope, so just kind of be aware of those requirements there. If you're doing electrical commissioning, we have all this equipment here, so you might see a little more power demands out of your kitchen area, so just keep that in mind. If you have backup power system, are we providing backup power to, say, our refrigeration systems? If so, we're going to want to make sure we're testing that so we're not spoiling a lot of money worth of food and stuff if we lose power the first time. And finally, domestic hot water. So we may have different demands in the kitchen than you have in the rest of your building. Maybe higher temperature demands. So mixing valve might be sending out, say, 110 to the bathrooms, but you might need to pull maybe 140-degree water out of that system for your kitchen, or you might have a complete separate system. So like I said, today we're going to focus on the ventilation systems, the HVAC systems, but there are many other things that could be thrown in your commissioning scope that you'd have to deal with. So we talked about the elements of the kitchen space and some of the special requirements. So how are we going to meet these requirements? This is just a simple basic diagram of how this could be approached. So on the right side, we have our common dining areas, your normal occupied areas. They are showing on this diagram here just your normal rooftop unit, return air supplier, outside air, bathroom exhaust, could be general exhaust. This is your typical heating, cooling systems for your temp and humidity control in your occupied space. You're normally not going to see too much fancy stuff there. You could have any number of setups there. You could have terminal units, VAVs, whatever it may be, serving your dining and other occupied areas. Big thing to notice here is, just like always in your occupied areas, slight pressurization. You see the little arrow at the bottom right showing that you're pressurizing your building as compared to the exterior of the building. So what you would typically see in your occupied areas. We move to the kitchen, kind of a visualization of what we talked about in the last few slides. So you're showing the kitchen hood, pulling that hot, moist, odorous air out from the kitchen, exhausting that out. We're showing here a makeup air unit that's pulling warm air in from outside, cooling it, pushing it back down into our space. And you're also going to have a HVAC system for the rest of your kitchen. You're not going to rely on your hood system and makeup air to provide your temperature and humidity control in the rest of your kitchen spaces. So a lot of times you'll see maybe dedicated HVAC systems for that area to avoid contaminations and to meet those special requirements, but that can be done many different ways. In the graphic here, we're showing a rooftop unit that again has supply, return, and outside air. Big thing here, we talked about pressure control being one of our big requirements. We still want to keep this area positively pressurized. So in the bottom left, we have a little arrow showing that positive pressurization. But the big thing here is to keep the kitchen areas negative pressure compared to the dining areas and the other occupied areas. That's the big thing we got to remember. Remember I told you about my client earlier that had issues before. That's where it came from, not keeping that negative pressurization. So how are we typically going to see this done? I know we had a question earlier, and this is right where we're going to talk about that. So fortunately, we have suppliers and manufacturers. They provide us all of this, the whole one package. So here we're showing the kitchen hood, the associated sensors, the exhaust fan, the makeup air unit. It's going to have could have all of its internal conditioning all wrapped up in that one package, the drives for your fan, and then your demand control kitchen ventilation processor. So that would be the brain of the system. All the information comes in there, and it takes that and decides what to do with your ventilation rates. This is a lot of times going to be mounted somewhere in the occupied space where the people are working in the kitchen can get to it. You'll probably have buttons so they can override, display, possibly see what's going on. You may be using buttons there to control lights under the hood. If there's any alarming capabilities, you might get the alarms directly here so the people working in the space know something is wrong right away. And then if there's any communication or integration with other aspects or other equipment or outside monitoring, it would all come through this. So you might have one contractor installs all of this. You're gonna have one rep or one team of reps come out. They'll do the startup. They'll make sure it's all working. They might even do the balancing. There's even some self-balancing systems out there. You'd have these folks represented from the manufacturer take care of all that, one nice system. And most of the time these go fairly well. But as you would expect, it's not always that easy. Depending on the type of space you have, the requirements of the space, the designers that are doing all this, you might not have that one big package system. You might see, for example, a hood being linked to an exhaust fan in its controller, and all of your makeup, air, and conditioning for the space could be coming from other building equipment. You might have a dedicated makeup air unit, or you might be pulling air from the other building systems, just depending on the setup. And this is where it gets a little more interesting for us when we're trying to provide commissioning. So you could have that hood system with its manufacturer does the startup there, gets all that going. These other building systems that have to work in conjunction with the hood system, you'd have, say, a mechanical contractor or manufacturer's reps that are doing the work there. And I've seen it before where we have a controls contractor that's tasked with integrating with all of this equipment and controlling all of this. So they're ultimately responsible for the temperature control, the humidity control, the pressure control, any scheduling, any economizers that we're going to be using. So it does get a little more exciting, and I never flipped a slide for you guys. So we could be using other building systems rather than just our nice big package system there. So we can start to see how we may have some challenges. We're going to be a little bit repetitive here because our big requirements are also some of our big challenges. The first big challenge we're going to have is getting our airflows and pressurization controls working correctly. We're varying the exhaust, we have to vary the makeup air, and not always that easy. You know how fans, 50% fan speed on one might not equal 50% volume on your makeup air fans, so it's not quite that simple. That can run into your pressure control issues. So keep all this in mind. Another big challenge that I've run into before is integration of different type systems. That last example where we might be working with a mechanical contractor, control contractor, and our hood manufacturer, are these things gonna be able to integrate properly? Are we gonna be able to get the points or control the points that we need off of each of these systems? So we need to look out for that. Alarms, are we going to be able to get alarms if that's something that's required? Are we looking at a specific fan fail alarm? Do we have a general alarm off the system? Are we going to be able to get that if that's required? If we're linking with other equipment, so say a makeup air unit, who's controlling that? Is it the BAS controlling all the modes of operation of our makeup air unit? Do we have package controls in that unit? If we do, what are the sequences that are going to come in that unit when it shows up from the factory? Are those sequences going to work with our design? Are they going to work with the rest of the equipment we have there? So we have a lot to think about when it comes to monitoring and control of these systems, especially if we're pulling together multiple systems to all work together to meet our requirements. And finally, coordination. So if we're working with different people, we always run into that old finger pointing thing on site. We've probably all seen, I see heads nodding right now. So your hood manufacturer comes out, he does his checkout, he does his startup, he does his paperwork, his warranty, boom, he's gone, he's out of there, right? And then, say our makeup air unit rep, he comes out, he overrides it in the heat, overrides it in the cool, dehumidification, ramps the fan, does his startup paperwork, boom, he's out of there, right? Controls contractor, what's he do? He comes in, he puts his devices in, he lands his wires, he does his checkout, He does his programming, and he is convinced that it's all working because he's sending it a signal. How often does that work? Yeah, I see a lot of people laughing. So that doesn't always work like that. So that's a challenge we're going to have to deal with when it comes time for testing and turnover, is all of that coordination. So how are we going to use commissioning to help overcome those challenges we just discussed? So first one, hopefully you've been listening to me for going on half an hour now. Hopefully by now we can recognize some of the special requirements we're going to deal with, and we can recognize some of the challenges we're going to have to face. So knowing what we're getting into, we can try to get ahead of these issues, try to be proactive rather than reactive. Let's address the issues that we know are coming before they become problems. So first step there. Second step, communication. Anyone here ever had a contractor just call you at the beginning of a project and say, let's work together so we can turn this thing over smoothly? Nope, one, wow. They're gonna hide till the end and then do what they're told they have to do so that they can get paid and go home. So let's start communication, start coordination early on in the project, because we may be dealing with different groups of people. Probably don't always see your kitchen hood manufacturer at your commissioning meeting. So let's at least touch base with these folks. Start communication early. We're going to be possibly dealing with mechanical controls, tab contractors. Let's make sure we start conversation earlier with these guys because we know what we're likely to run into. So let's try to get ahead of it. This can help with your scheduling as well. Maybe schedule your site visits to be on site when certain manufacturers are there. Talk to these folks. As recently, I was out at a startup, and I was talking with the startup technician, and there was a way one item was controlled, and he had an issue with that. He said, that's not how we normally do it. Like, it's not going to work with the sequences that we're used to dealing with. It's not how the manufacturer recommends it. That's not how I recommend it. I would normally like to see it this other way. That's good information. Took that back and started doing what I needed to do with that to figure out the next steps. I get that guy's startup report. It's not even mentioned. So he did his startup checkout, blessed it, and was out of there. Never even mentioned that that could be a potential issue. He just did his job, took his readings, did everything he had to do, and he was gone. So by being out there, I was able to get information off of these folks that help get in front of an issue that we're going to have later on. So communication, big deal here. We started off by saying we're going to be proactive rather than reactive. That starts early on in the project with our design reviews. When you know you're going to be dealing with one of these spaces, let's take these drawings, get a good look at them as early as we can, and keep in mind the things we talked about. So look through the drawings, figure out exactly how you're providing that ventilation, how they're providing the makeup air. Make sure that's going to be able to control the pressure properly. Look at how the temperature and humidity is going to be controlled in your kitchen. Read the sequence of operations. Whatever the designer gives you, look through that. Make sure it's going to function the way that it's intended right off the bat here. And then look at any monitoring requirements that you may have. Is this system going to be integrated back to your BAS? Are we going to pull energy readings off of this? Let's just get into these drawings early on and see what we have. Next, when we get into construction, look at your submittals. We get a chance to do submittal reviews for most of our projects. So let's look at the obvious stuff, but everyone looks at the obvious stuff. Every person this submittal goes to is going to look at the capacities, the size, and the layout of the units, compare that to the drawings, sign off on that, it's gone. Let's think about the operation of the units, okay? How are we controlling that ventilation and that makeup air with these units? Are all the sensors provided that we're going to need? Do these operations meet the project requirements? Are we integrating with a BAS or another piece of equipment? Are we pulling controls off of that? Look at those. Take a look at, say, the communication protocol. If we have a LawnWorks BAS system and we have to pull energy data off of a backnet hood, what do we need to do there? So pay attention to that when you're doing your submittal reviews. Try to catch anything that could be an issue for you later on. And finally, one thing I've started doing that seems to be very helpful is doing a meeting to review the controls with your team once you get all the submittals. So get your equipment submittals, get your controls submittal. Basically what we're going to do here, there was a presentation last year, an hour long at CxEnergy. I was pretty good on conducting these meetings. We'll just do a short version here. Get all of your players into a room or a setting, whatever it may be these days, and work through the sequence of operations for all these equipment. Make sure each piece of equipment is going to be able to do that. So you'll have hopefully your designer, your manufacturers, reps, controls folks, whoever might be involved, whatever contractors you might be dealing with, pull them together and read through step by step what we're doing. Might run into some simple things or some more complicated things that you can get ahead of. So I had one recently where we had a condensate pan that had a high condensate switch. The controls contractor assumed that was going to be provided with the equipment. The equipment manufacturer just assumed that was coming as a controls package. So we were able to realize that there was that gap early on, figured out who's responsible for it, and they ended up getting installed and no issue from that. Well, we did have one issue, one of them didn't work, but that's always going to happen. So might have missing sensors. We talked about package controls. That's one of the issues I run into over and over again. So if there's a unit that has its own internal controls, have a rep from that manufacturer there, have those control sequences there. Make sure that's going to work with the rest of your system. Make sure that's going to work with your design sequence of operations and all of your design requirements. Nice thing is if you come up with a design question and have the designer right there, that can make that a little more simple. So some of these systems we're looking at here, there might be new technology, or maybe the designer worked off of a basis of operation or basis of design of one manufacturer, and the contractors picked a different one, and they might have new technology or something where having a designer in the room can kind of clear up any discrepancies. It might be something where the new technology that's in the equipment that's being provided might be a little superior to the design. We need the designer's blessing to be able to make all of your equipment and your designs match. And this helps start coordination between contractors. We talked about the finger pointing just a moment ago. If those folks are all in one room talking about getting this stuff integrated and getting this stuff working, it gives them a chance to talk to each other and kind of start bouncing off of each other what they need to do. So we don't want that finger pointing at the end where I send it a signal, my system works, and nothing's communicating, nothing's doing what it's supposed to. So if you put these folks in a room, start that conversation. Just said a moment ago, communication was the big thing. So if we can start that early, not only between us and our team, but between the team members themselves, we can make things run a little bit smoother. So once we've done our design reviews, once we've had a chance to review the O&Ms, we've reviewed the submittals, we've done our controls review meeting, we're pretty much under full understanding of what we're doing here, we can start putting together our functional performance tests. Just like always, we want these to be a detailed, specific action item and a detailed, specific expected response. What's a little bit different here is you might not be really familiar with exactly the sequence that's going on within these kitchen ventilation systems. We're trying to get an idea of everything early on. We've talked to everybody, try to clear it all up. If you still don't know exactly how you need to write your test for this system, try to get an idea of how to do it, and then just maybe highlight that section, and we'll nail that down a little bit later on. So the idea here is get your functional tests, at least a draft, wrote early, out early. Get these in the hands of your commissioning team. Get these in the hands of your manufacturers. Get these in the hands of your contractors. Get these in the hands of the designer. And have everybody take a look at them. So what I like to do is distribute them out to my team and set a date to have them reviewed by. Give them 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, just to try to set an end date for comments to come back to us. We get these comments back from these folks, and you never know what you might get. And this is where you have to kind of determine how to handle each one. You could have simple comments that help make your test a little bit better, a little more detailed. So we talked about alarms earlier. So if you're expecting a fan fail alarm, maybe the way that this processor works, your little display screen in the kitchen is not going to say fan failed. It might say loss of ventilation or loss of airflow or something. So you might get simple comments like that back that help you know exactly what to expect when you're on site. Other comments you may get back are entire modes of operation that your team wasn't planning on providing. So what do you do then? Is that a RFI? Is it something that they missed? Is it something where they have to look at what they're installing and figure out how to get it to do that mode? So you can run into kind of different issues with your tests that you can correct up front. So take these comments and make updates or communicate with your team, do whatever you need to do to get your functional test exactly right before you go out and do your test. So you want to get these done early, make sure they're reviewed, make sure they're accurate, make sure they're complete, make sure they're usable, make sure you can walk through these steps. So what we're trying to avoid is how often have you been out on site, you get to a step in a test, maybe it's a mode of operation or an alarm, you go to test that and these folks look you in the eye and say, I didn't know we needed that. I didn't know we needed that mode. I didn't know we needed that alarm. Where'd that come from? Well, it came from the drawings, but nonetheless, let's get your eyes on it so you can see, make sure it's in there. And one other kind of added benefit that I've seen from working with your teams to review and update your functional tests is they get a little bit of ownership in it. So we've all passed out these tests. Hey, take this out there, sit down with your equipment, run through it step by step, make sure it's working, right? We know how that always goes. They might look at it, they might not. They might tell you a story, they might not. If they've helped you develop that test, they're a little more likely to use that test to help them make sure their stuff is working, and that eventually makes your life a little bit easier. So get these tests out to these folks. Finally, comes time to witness the functional test. Just keep in mind, scheduling. We've been in this project now since the early design phase. We've been through submittal reviews. We've met with these contractors. We've talked to them on site. We know who we need. We know if we need a tab contractor. We know what different manufacturer reps we need. We know if we need a controls guy, and we might even know the exact people that we've been dealing with and want to get those folks out there with us. So let's put a little extra effort in the scheduling. It'll pay off in the long run. Make sure you have these folks that you need on site when you're out there to run through your test. So hopefully, since we've been involved in this project since the very early on, we're not going to have too many issues. We know it doesn't always go like that. So, for example, that school I showed you, it had a makeup air unit system that was packaged with the same manufacturer's equipment for the hood. All of that worked fine and dandy. We ran through that test, no issue. The rest of the kitchen was heated and cooled by a rooftop unit. And we had set in our controls review meeting. The guy had provided me the sequence of operation for that rooftop unit. I went through that thing line by line, marked it up. We went back and forth, nailed down exactly how that unit was going to meet the requirements for that space, meet the sequence of operation, do what we needed to do. Wouldn't you know, the wrong unit shows up. So all the controls inside of it were for a completely different type system. So we had done everything we could do up to that point, and can't do it all, right? We can't do it all. But here's the good thing. You involved with the project, you go through these reviews, you communicate with your contractors, get your tests written where they're complete and usable and accurate. We all have a clear, well-documented expectation of the system. You and I know exactly how this thing's supposed to perform. Everybody's on board. So if you do run into an issue, makes it a little bit simpler. You want to track your issue, work towards a resolution, do your retesting, and all you have to do is get this system working the way that everyone understands how it's supposed to be working. So even if you run into issues, since we've done our due diligence, we've been involved with the project, we understand a little bit more of what we're looking at here. So that's all I have for you folks today. Move into some questions.
Earlier, a diagram of a typical setup. Is it common to see air return from the kitchen, like return air, as opposed to just 100% outside air?
Yeah, so you got to remember, we talked about earlier, the ventilation systems, they're going to, most of the time, operate based on the cooking load, and they're high energy using systems. So they're going to pull air out and throw new air in. There is no return air there. At night, when you're unoccupied, you might need conditioning there. And also, our kitchen hood system is primarily for ventilation. We may heat, cool, or dehumidify the air we're using for makeup. But the rest of your area, so we showed the storage areas, we showed the dining areas, we showed the locker room areas and all that. That ventilation system for your hoods is not going to be used most of the time to ventilate and condition the rest of your space. So you typically will have other HVAC systems within your kitchen area to provide conditioning for the rest of the space. And I've seemed to see it a lot where it's kind of a separate system. And imagine that's so you're not taking a chance of mixing your contaminants in your kitchen with the rest of the space. So thanks for the question. Anything else?
You mentioned the use of infrared sensors in the hood.
Yes.
I have a little bit of experience with temperature sensors and the specific placement. Kind of weird by the manufacturer, but how reliable are those over time? With the use of the grease and wiring and all that, it would seem like a huge maintenance thing.
Yeah, so the question was maintenance of, say, infrared sensors in your kitchen hood. So that is one of the big concerns with them. So the upside of using an infrared sensor or an optical sensor or thermal imaging sensor is we can react these systems a lot quicker to activity underneath the hood. But the big downside is maintenance. So if they don't maintain them properly, we're gonna lose that pretty quickly. So you are right that maintenance is an issue there.
So really the more reliable is the temperature sensor.
Correct. A temperature sensor or scheduling or combination of both is going to give you a little more reliability. But again, the downside is how long it takes for those sensors to react. So that's why you're seeing optical sensors, infrared sensors, thermal imaging systems is you turn on something, you get fumes, smoke almost immediately. And if your hood system doesn't react to that, those contaminants could get out into your other spaces before the hood system has a chance to react. So that's the trade-off you have here. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Would you recommend specific training for those sensors to the owner or the maintenance so that people working properly, or could you do that? Or?
Yeah, so as commission providers, a lot of times we are involved in the training, and these maintenance items are something that hopefully when you're going through training plans, that's number one thing you're looking for. So we're hoping that we can get the maintenance staff and possibly the users. It's always difficult to get users involved in training, but they're supposed to clean those hoods anyway. So if you've ever worked in a kitchen, that's one of the lower end jobs you might get stuck on if you make the manager mad is going up and cleaning these hoods. It's quite the pain. Yeah. So we're hoping that when we are providing training, we can get users and the maintenance folks in there to make sure that they understand how to clean and maintain these systems so we don't end up with some of the issues we talked about earlier. Give it your effort, communicate with your team, your owner, and make sure your training plan has that as one of the top things.
Just with the training, that we need to make sure that they have like access to work so that they can access to that. Things that can be like grease, right? That temperature sensor.
Yeah, depending on where they're installed, it's going to be a little different. So the higher maintenance items are going to be your thermal imaging, your infrared, or your optical sensors. Correct. So that has to be able to see the cooking surfaces and the smoke. So they'll be easier to get to. The temperature sensors might be a little more difficult.
So if they wanted to go that route, would you recommend that they install an access damper near or access to work near that? You know, because I think the photo you showed it in depth, right?
So maintenance access is always important. So that's something that we'll look at too when we're out there. If we know that we're putting a sensor somewhere that might be difficult to get to, how often does that need to be cleaned? Because once those things foul up, it's not going to be as accurate.
No, I was just gonna piggyback off that. Typically, hoods, at least in Florida, the maintenance guys for the building do not maintain those hoods. They usually have to call a specialized company every 6 months to actually clean and maintain those hoods. So the training of the maintenance guys, usually they don't even get involved with the maintaining of the hoods itself. Just as a comment.
Did you have something?
No. So just a general question. Is there any recommendation earlier on in the design review to say keep it simple a little bit? We don't need these thermal image sensors and so forth. If the hood already has a 5 or, I don't expect it to be more than 5 or 10 horsepower fan motor which is running intermittently. They don't leave it on all the time because it's noisy. When they need it, they turn it on. When they don't need it, they turn it off. So, we can make these things very complicated and we don't realize how the sensors get out of calibration, how to keep them in line. So the energy savings that we're getting out of that, if I do a real analysis on it, it will be bare the minimum basically on some of these traditional kitchens and schools and all that kind of stuff. So just a suggestion is to have a recommendation to say, do we really need to have all of this stuff in here?
Right. If you didn't hear, he was suggesting simplifying these systems so that we don't run into issues with maintenance and such. And we talked about the energy savings, what it's based on. So it's trade-off you're going to deal with. If you have a massive system, it might be worth putting in some of these more complex controls so you're not running something at full speed unnecessarily. If you're working with a little system, you have less to gain energy savings wise. Good.
So have you done a renovation where you've been able to do the proof of concept where we actually metered before and after in terms of adding these systems to the kitchen to see the savings or actually recognize the actual savings that were projected?
So I haven't done the question was, have I done a renovation and compared before and after energy savings? No, I haven't, but there's been a lot of them done. So I haven't personally done it. And a lot of times it comes out to the 30, 40, 50% range, depending on, like I said, all of the other factors. So it is worth doing this demand control kitchen ventilation system. And in these days, it's becoming a little more of the norm rather than the exception. So there is a lot to gain depending on the system and the factors we talked about earlier. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the reason I brought it up is because I've done some, and as you got more complex, the cost to install, the cost to program, the cost to do everything started driving that payback down.
Thanks.
As they get more complex, do you have trouble training the kitchen staff to do something? Do you find that they didn't work with the override systems as perfectly?
So the question was, staff working with more complex systems. It's kind of hard to say. So the idea of the more complex systems is it's less user interface. So if we're using our super complex thermal imaging systems, they don't have to do anything. When they flip on a piece of equipment, the system automatically reacts. So when it comes to training, they will know how to override the systems. They'll know how to turn the lights on or off or whatever they need to do through the little control panel there. And hopefully they get some training on how to clean these systems. As far as the setup and programming, that's going to be your manufacturers and stuff. As you can imagine, if you get multiple hood systems, you have thermal imaging systems where there's multiple pieces of equipment that it's set up to react to. That's going to be more on the startup technicians and manufacturer.
I just had experience where, especially with the staffing change figure, that, people come in, they don't understand switches and control panel.
The hope is that the system can do it all, so we don't have to rely on the guy there. Because when the occupants get involved, normally they're going to go hit full speed, and that's all it is. So.
So you mentioned earlier, like condensate drain pan, flow switch, things like that. Do you commonly see the status of the makeup air unit interlocked with the exhaust fan so that if it trips off, that just shuts off the exhaust fans? Because it's a little bit different, whereas in a comfort environment, it's just people getting comfortable. Like you're generating fumes and steam and all this stuff. So it seems a little bit of a conundrum is, do I interrupt, do I shut down the exhaust source because I don't have that negative air source and then risk filling the room with smoke, or do I try to have an emergency source of negative air, just in case what you typically see?
So we got the 2-minute warning there. That's what I was seeing over there. So you're right. You would want to not start your makeup air unit if your exhaust fan failed. The other way around.
It's obvious on one side, whenever you start your exhaust fans, you want to start your air unit so the makeup air unit goes off.
Yep, so you wouldn't want to pressurize your space. So I guess if that fails, that kind of puts it in the hands of the staff in the kitchen. You're going to get hopefully a real loud alarm and some red flashing lights if you lose your ventilation, and you'll quickly have a room full of smoke. I used to work in a kitchen when I was in college, and the exhaust fans were connected to the fire alarm. So someone on the next building over, 11 floors up, burnt popcorn. Our exhaust system shut down, and it was hazy. It was hard to see from me to you within a few minutes. So you had to leave because the alarm was off, but you didn't want to come back in because it was not a comfortable environment. So we may have time for one or two more. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming out this morning, and enjoy the rest of your week here.